presentation. So there we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the first Energy Symposium of the fall 2023 semester for the University of Texas at Austin Energy Symposium. I'm Carrie King, Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute. And it is a pleasure to have our speaker today. But before I introduce our speaker for today, I will give you a hint of what's coming up for the next 2 weeks. So next week, we will have a talk from Scott Huey and Sean Boardman, who are with Green Star BCS. They're a consulting firm and informing people about investing in decarbonization technology. So the title of their talk is Decarbonization, the New High-Tech Sector. And then the following week, September 12th, would be Art Berman, Director of Labyrinth Consulting Services, Houston, Texas. He will have a somewhat provocative talk here. Energy transition to renewables condemns civilization to status quo, path of growth, and biophysical destruction. So he'll discuss the challenges from shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But today it is my pleasure to host Michael Benedict Umoa. He is a sustainable development economist, and he's interested in topics related to climate change, sustainable development, risk management, business strategy, and behavioral economics. So not only trying to put these ideas into practice, he is currently a PhD student at the University College of London. He's meeting us today from his office in Dallas, Texas. But he has an MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business and Master's in International Economic Development from George Washington University, BA in International Relations and Business Administration from Carroll College, and a BA coursework in Geography and Sociology at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. So he's also been working director as a director of ESG engagement at EOS Federated Hermes. EOS is a subset of Federated Hermes Limited, covering engagement in North America and Europe with a focus on technology, hardware, and software, mining and materials, energy, and finance. So he kind of is speaking to us about how to engage with companies about their ESG and sustainability goals. So his abstract today, coherence in any form of policy or agenda implementation at a practical level implies that all policies in all sectors that have an impact in the same areas and intersect will seek synergies or at least avoid negative effects. This requires clear definition of the objectives, both policies and actions. What are the possible synergies and criteria for determining which aspect will be given priority in the event of a conflict? So trade-offs. If done right, coherence can contribute to transparent cooperation and build trust among the partners or participants to reach compromise between actors and lead to better socio-economic outcomes for all. It is in identifying these common goals while ensuring that the work of one part does not undermine the work of another. So this thinking, although theorized, I guess he's got his academic hat on, his practical hat, describes the challenge and need for considering climate change as a risk and opportunity for sustainable development, in particular with regard to the energy transition. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Michael Benedict Umoa, and he is going to speak to us just from the heart with no slides. So I'm going to turn off the slideshow, and Michael, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for the introduction. And I think, Carrie, you and I agree that people are allowed to sort of ask questions as I go, because I'm hoping that this can be some sort of a dialogue that we have, right? I think it's very important to establish a number of things before I get into the sort of the details of the discussion. As an academic, but also a practitioner, I'm a firm believer in the fact that there's no absolute information or perfect information. So what we're going to discuss here is going to be based on not just what I know, but also some of the information that is out there that I think most people in the academic community, also in the practice community, are still trying to figure out. And Carrie, you and your team are working a number of things in some of the deficiencies we have in our models that are out there in the world and how we kind of address some of those gaps. The other thing is I'm going to also speak broadly global in nature. There will be some little underpinnings coming from national context, but I think a large majority of the discussion will focus on global energy transition as well. So just kind of bear those two sort of in mind as a concept. So please feel free to chime in with your questions as we go. and let me know. I'll stop in my tracks and answer wherever possible. I thought it would be very important for me to start this discussion by, first of all, breaking, and I don't know, Kerry, if you can bring the slide back, maybe people can see the topic, but if anybody saw it earlier on, we're talking about coherence, which is a term that probably people have seen before, or policy coherence, those in international sort of economic sort of relations and development you've seen, or in the policy circles, you've heard it before. There's a lot of literature on policy coherence. I think it's not a new term. Then you find this quite everywhere you go, particularly in Europe, but in the US here, given our system of operation, we do also have some level of coherence that happen when policies come to fruition. And then I'll kind of segue into these two dynamic global agreements, the climate change and sustainable development goals, which have become central to the future of our emerging and evolving economies around the world. And obviously, in between these will be the discussions that are going to focus on the energy transition. So I just kind of wanted to kind of give this framework so that everybody can sort of get on the same page. So when we talk about coherence, I mean, by definition, you could just Google this, right? The idea is that you're looking for ways to have policies that you create somehow be much more coherent. So basically, you want to make sure they are well aligned, right? And it may sound very simple, but often these do not happen the way we think they should. So a classic example that I'll give is if you wanted to maybe pass a policy to address income inequality, you have to look at the goals and objectives of those policies, and then equally look at what other impacts may be sort of affect a result based on maybe other sort of job growth related policies that you may have, and looking for the synergies between the two or the trade-offs. As Kerry probably said, if you're an economist, you probably understand this much more perfectly. But the trade-offs of policies are very important, both in the policy itself, but also in the implementation. And in North America, particularly in the United States, whenever there is a regulatory framework that comes out or something like that, most government departments will open up for public comments. And these public comments allow different interest groups to kind of issue the ideas or their recommendations or feedback to the regulatory body to ensure that a lot of the different nuances are sort of addressed if in case there may be some impacts that may be felt in other areas that may not have been considered by that. And in practice, you may have a scenario where different government bodies or agencies may be looking at taking certain actions, but have to sort of align with other departments as well. So it's very intuitive and kind of almost like systematic if you think about it. In the European Union, as an example, we've seen a lot of policy coherence because you're looking at just kind of the area and the number of countries that are there, and you want to make sure there's alignment in both domestic and also regional policies. And in national context as well, in places like Norway, Switzerland, sometimes you see those efforts kind of coming clearly in terms of coherence in general. So that's kind of where you get that concept coming through. And I hope that is sort of helpful to all of you listening in so that you kind of get a bigger picture of what the concept of coherence is. Now, it is difficult in practice, but notionally, you almost want to see a lot of policies take this road because you address a lot of inefficiencies, both in implementation and outcome. But even if you don't actually get to see any negative externality or either any kind of trade-offs that are going to be negative, you are at least aware of those trade-offs and you are able to sort of think about solutions that may be used to address them. So that's kind of where we come to with coherent the definition.
All right. So Michael, there is a question. So people are listening. Good. Sure. It is kind of what you just said. So maybe there may be nothing to add. I think you were referencing the EU, European Union there. So the question is just kind of straightforward. Do you believe there is a coherent global, well, it says global plan for energy transition, but maybe you're saying that the EU is relatively coherent or coherent for your purposes? Yeah. Any elaboration now that you can give? Thanks.
No. So what I meant by there is coherence in the EU is like they often take the practice of coherence a little more serious, given the makeup of the institutional bodies within the European Union. Now, to your question about whether there's actually a global coherence framework on energy transitions, I think we are all kind of we all have a seat, let me put it that way, at the display of the struggle in trying to come up with a global sort of energy transition sort of policy that aligns more effectively with local context, regional context, and other places. But I think there is an intentional effort across different countries and regional bodies to address some of these gaps. You know, I always say that some energy solutions are very much local. You can't have wind energy everywhere. You know, you have to look at different geomorphologic sort of issues and climatology issues to sort of then bring into that mix to look at what energy solution is appropriate for a particular area, right? So there are going to be clearly winners and losers in some context in how you address different energy spectrum, but that is not to say that there's one unified global sort of context in that sort of rationale. So in many cases, when we talk about policy coherence, you often would hear people sort of bring it down to the national level. Now, in this sort of discussion, the two big policies that I was sort of thinking of or been sort of evaluating over the past few years has been around the sort of the Paris Climate Agreement, which most of us are very familiar with, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I want you to keep these two things in mind. The SDGs, although broadly very, very wide in terms of its breadth and rich in areas that it wants to accomplish, it is not a binding sort of resolution or agreement that countries are held to. Now, there are voluntary mechanisms through the UN sort of high-level political forum that allow sort of reviews to happen, much less so like the Paris Climate Agreement, where there is a sort of a legally binding sort of document that has to go through this sort of annual review process using the nationally determined contributions that we are very much aware of. So those two are sort of the broader agreements that I want to sort of typify and then bring down to the national level to sort of look at how coherence happens, particularly across the spectrum of energy transitions. So I don't know if that answers the question, because I saw the question come through, but that's kind of relatively from the EU perspective and how I'm going to take the SDGs and the Paris Agreement into the discussion of the energy transition. So while we wait for more questions to come in, I want to start off with global sort of agreements. And I think, you know, often when we think of global agreements, on environmental front, you are faced with a number of issues. There is a very good database at the University of Oregon and also one in Geneva Institute, I think of Development or something like that. And they have all this international, both bilateral and multilateral environmental agreements that dates back to the 1800s. And it's actually interesting when you take a look at some of them, you have international agreements or bilateral in that context or multilateral agreements that focus on environmental issues related to banana, oranges, some even related to ocean life that, you know, we think is more recent, but you go to the 1800s, 1900s, countries really were thinking about a lot of these different spectrum. And if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, where we have the kind of the change in our sort of economic systems, including our technical economic systems, our socio-economic systems, our mechanical economic systems, all of those different systems that we thought of and changed dramatically. If you go through that, there wasn't really much effort sort of geared towards it. It was almost like post-effect. So when you see the smogs up in the atmosphere, or you saw a lot of different sort of particulate emissions that were impacting people's health, a lot of these things came after the transition, right? And so when you revert back to those and you take a look at the lessons that we've learned from that ecosystem, the issue of coherence becomes more relevant now because we are actually going through a significant transformation within our global system, nationally and globally, regionally as well. Now, the word coherence, you know, if you look at it from an agreement perspective or an environmental agreement perspective, the OECD, which is a representative of a lot of the large industrialized nations, really kind of used to have this word called policy coherence for development. And the whole idea of this PCD, which is what the acronym is, was to make sure that developed countries really bear in mind that their policies needed to be aligned more effectively developing world countries when they are actually looking at financial flows that will support the growth of all of those different sort of emerging or low to middle income countries. And then with the passage of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement, we move into what we call the PCSD, which is the Policy Coherent for Sustainable Development. And the idea is that when you look at most of the climate models that we have today, I think prior to AR6, we had more of the RCP sort of pathway modeling. And then we moved into the SSP, which included the socio-economic part of the models that were developed or used to assess different future, which includes things like following a fossil fuel development path, or you're going to follow sort of a regional rivalry path, an inequality path, or a very kind of low carbon development pathway. There's about 5 of these different SSPs that are then leveraged in the, sort of the broader integrated assessment models. So those things were designed in a way to help us integrate the different sort of socioeconomic issues that we kind of deal with naturally in society. And so the natural intent was in 2013, and for those of you who follow a lot of the climate negotiations, I was in Lima when a lot of the discussions were happening pre-2015. And the goal was to try to get coherence ahead so that we could understand the ways in which different sort of pathways could affect society at large. And we're talking about society in terms of both economic challenges and social sort of challenges. The only problem with these models is that you lack feedback, right? And I think, Kerry and I were talking about this, that if you look at a lot of our sort of integrated assessment models, whether it's a partial equilibrium, or you're looking at a general equilibrium, or some sort of other category of integrated assessment models, you're faced with the idea of what kind of feedback you're going to get from a policy or behavior point of view. I usually call it the choice framework, because what is happening is rationally different parts of interest groups, be it in a national context or in a global context, are going to make decisions based on what information they have available to them. And then there may be information that we have no control over. Some of those will be just what happened in Ukraine, what is going on in Ukraine and Russia. You could have never predicted something like that, right? I remember one of my famous professors used to tell me that, Michael, anytime somebody tells you to predict the future, just take the check, predict, and then quit right after that. Because there are so many different uncertainties. Even 1% uncertain is a greater uncertainty at the end of the day. But you cannot predict some of those things, and the feedback that comes into that can sometimes change the dynamics of some of those future sort of trajectories. And that kind of brings us to a very tough position when you're dealing with energy transition. The transition with energy is that we have a very robust, mostly in the Western world, and I'm talking about in North America and Europe, we have a very robust existing infrastructure. These infrastructures have been built on a system and sort of the physical flow of energy systems that we've relied on for decades and over a century. And so these systems cannot just be changed at a flip of a switch. And once you start thinking about changing, you're not talking about changes that are just going to just affect those physical systems in terms of the pipelines or the plants that you have. No, that's not going to happen because if you look down the value chain, our buildings, the way we organize our lives, the way we actually feed ourselves, the way we do everything, we've built the entire infrastructure on this enormous scale of energy system. And that cannot be changed just overtly like that. And even if you want to change it, you're talking about, limited resources available to do that. And one of the things that Coherence gets you so frustrated to think about is if I'm a national government and I want to spend billions of dollars in changing my entire sort of energy infrastructure, I have to think about what other objectives of my governing agenda that might lose in terms of that. I have to think about where those revenues are going to come from. I have to think about the way jobs are going to change and how people are going to move along those jobs. I think recently I gave a private talk and somebody said, I have spent the last 25 years of my life studying petroleum engineering. And all I can think about is that in the next 20 years of my career, I see my income diminishing, right? Now, I don't have any data to back some of those things, but the reality is you expect there to be some wage impact. You expect that to translate into some sort of, well-being impact. There are going to be tremendous changes in certain areas that often we don't think about. So as you think about sort of mitigation efforts in that spectrum, regards to how to get to a 1.5 degree alignment, there's also a whole spectrum of broader social and economic issues that becomes reflected. Now, I'm a very honest academic person, and I'll be honest with you. If you look at my background, you will know clearly that I grew up in Ghana, spent some time in Europe, and in here. And I've worked quite a lot within the sort of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank system as a consultant, traveled around the world and seen different projects and seen different economies and done a number of research in emerging markets. And so I'm often biased because sometimes I've realized the levers that these emerging markets have to pull are essentially very limited, right? And one of the classic examples I've always given is like, think of the global development around solar panels or wind, right? Where are those innovation and development happening, right? The National Innovation System concept that was developed by the OECD that are very heavily applied in most developed markets are not the same way in emerging and developing or low to middle income countries. They don't have the existing innovation system, the capacity, as well as the resources to be able to elevate that. So that if you move into this new era of energy system where it's pure play, let's say renewables, you're going to have greater inequality to some level of extent because most of these countries are going to have to deal with more imports. So you're going to see GDP imbalance with import and export relative to energy, because when energy is a very high sort of part of many of this economy's agendas, right? So you think about that kind of impact over a longer period of time, and then you reflect on the inequality sort of changes that may happen in some of these markets, it becomes very concerning. Not necessarily to say that it should push us away from addressing these gaps, but we should be aware of this potential damages or liabilities that may occur within the human fiber or the human development indicators, the HDI, that is being measured. So that's kind of some of the issues that you face or you deal with when you're dealing with this convoluted. But often people talk about
Michael, there's a couple questions related to this.
Yeah.
So one is kind of maybe a little on the ground here. I'll just read it. Do you agree that over the next 10 years, the transition will result in more emissions versus no transition due to effects, for example, of massive mining, and that this is maybe not, it says being revealed to the public, but it kind of gets back to your feedback discussion there before, if we have to do much more mining for minerals. How do we think about that? So how do you think about that? Do you think we're modeling this well? Go ahead.
I think Kerry and I are talking about is we're not modeling this very well. I think there's a lot of work to do. It's really critical minerals is an emerging area that nobody's talking about. And some of the things that keep me up at night is the fact that in policymaking, you have a theoretical agenda setting. And when people set up their mind on doing A, B, C, they are very narrowly focused on that. And I get it. System thinking is a very hard thing to do. The human mind from a behavior perspective is not designed to focus on multiple issues at the same time. And therefore, there's a need for agenda setting. And for those of you who don't understand agenda setting, think of turning on your TV, right? Every news media basically tells you what to focus on. They highlight you the breaking news. And if somebody keeps your mind on that, that becomes topical until it dissipates and sort of goes away. So that's the same thing. And I think in general, when you look at the global environmental system, there is a little problem of agenda setting. Now, I cannot overwhelmingly answer your question, say in the next 10 years, there's going to be more emissions because of the mining. Now, there are problems with critical resources. It's not just it doesn't have to do with just energy systems per se. There are also new technologies, including our laptops and our phones, that rely on these critical minerals. And you're talking about some of them that have inherent challenges beyond just even carbon and methane. You can think of greater health and soil issues that are not even addressed in this category. There's a good work that has been done by the Department of Defense here in the US, and also I think the DOE on critical minerals in general and the supply chain that is beneficial, because we all know that critical minerals, a certain component of the wind turbine comes from this few select of these critical minerals. And I'm talking about critical minerals inclusive of copper and all those other metals that are needed to sort of address some of the transition. The World Bank has done a good study about the gap that we have in meeting those minerals. Their emissions sort of aspect of it, as Kerry just said, I think a lot more modeling is needed in order to look at what are the potential emissions that we are going to sort of have to address over a period of time in order to kind of get there. I know the mining sector is going through a significant amount of change with facilities and all of those different things. The benefits of carbon capture obviously still lagging, but still relevant in a discussion. But the next 10 years is going to be a very tough one. I think we are going to get to the point, and Kerry, you in the modeling world as I am, we're going to get to a point where we're going to start seeing some of the feedback that we did not think about, which I think is the biggest liability in our existing models, whether we like it or not. And I think is well acknowledged in the literature. And that's going to determine how we kind of get far. I think you had a second question.
Right, a couple more have appeared, but this one is referring to you just talking about infrastructure in general and this kind of thing. So specifically on the concept of updating existing infrastructure and how that could potentially be a barrier, especially in the energy sector. So how do we deal with updating this existing infrastructure to support the transition and still remain resilient?
It's a very good question. And not long ago, I think I was having a discussion with someone who said to me, and they're in the energy sector, and they said, listen, we make a lot of money, and we think, we can invest in modernizing our infrastructure. But even with our profits, year on year for over a decade, we will still not be able to do that. So I think in practice and in academic literature, people have translated things like the PPP model, which is the public-private partnership model, into a shared infrastructure discussion. And when we talk about shared infrastructure, the whole idea is there's some sort of government ownership with private ownership that then you bring the funding together and you're able to incentivize a rapid development of those kinds of infrastructure needs. But let me say this, some of the technical issues are still being resolved. I worked at Bechtel Corporation for many years, and I remember we were looking at retrofitting a lot of different, and there's actually a good short case studies that were written, retrofitting some old power plants, and some of them you have to make some critical choices that you cannot actually modernize the infrastructure requirement. You simply have to just switch. And that's going to cost you, a lot of resources. And where's that money going to come from? Well, you have to think about, from an economic point of view, look at the value chain of how governments and society raises money, right? If the company decides to go to the public market and raise capital, well, they got to have to find a way to make those money back. If the government decides to provide subsidies, money doesn't grow on trees, as we say. We have to find a way to sort of recoup that back in some sort of taxation regime or whatever. So there's going to be some sort of cost incurred in that way. And there are so many different, I think, models that are out there that are looking at how we address some of these gaps. But I think ultimately, this is going to be a very big area. I think the numbers in terms of monetary wise, we're talking about trillions of dollars just to kind of upgrade global energy systems, just to get as to where we want to get to.
Okay, I can ask some other ones here if you.
Yeah, sure.
Just a couple more. You mentioned just kind of systemic thinking and policy making. So the question's short and sweet, hard. How are we going to address challenges to promote critical and systemic thinking and policy making? And as you're speaking here, it's making me think about, you're speaking a bit about countries, decision making at a national level, but I don't know, how do we think about companies or perhaps even large or international companies that are making their own kinds of decisions? How does that play out differently in your roles?
So at a national level, let me talk about, most of you who are into the academic literature will know this, and I'll explain it for those who may not know. There is a sort of a body of methodology that often is referred to as a policy network analysis. And I'm using that as a frame to sort of guide the way I'm answering this question. So policy network analysis basically is a methodology that says that, hey, how do we think about the way policies are made and impact reflect outcomes. And you're looking at interest group, you're looking at the issues, you're looking at the actors, right? Which is the policymakers themselves. And then you're looking at other interest groups, and that could be businesses, that could be NGOs, that could be civil society organizations, think tanks, that could be academic institutions, that could just be communities themselves. So in the US, when certain sort of regulations coming out from, let's say, the EPA or the DOE, sometimes you see a call for comments that will come out. And that kind of forces a lot of the complementary nature of policy alignment and also coherence that we kind of seek to always achieve. Now, obviously, businesses have to make their own unique decisions based on ultimately what a business imperative is. And I want us to bear in mind this word, business imperative, which is that businesses have an ultimate responsibility to create whatever return plus responsible, sustainable sort of business model that will benefit them in the long run. And so businesses have different motivations, but the same system thinking is applicable. If you are a business and you are thinking of the future, whether you are thinking about how, let me put it, if you're in the oil and gas sector, right? And I worked in the oil and gas sector, I worked in Aramco for quite a bit. If you're thinking about your mainstay as a business and you're thinking about how you're going to exist tomorrow, obviously there are concepts around stranded assets. There are issues around future demand for oil and gas and what that is going to look like. You think through that, and then you think about the way your business right now is going to exist in your relationship between you and your suppliers and the consumers, and the different value chains that are going to be needed to be changed. I always say that when we think of energy transition, sometimes we only focus on the electricity side. But broadly, when you think about the entire ecosystem, sometimes in the future, we may have to think about a different part that the energy transition impacts. So if you are an oil producer, as an example, in a barrel of oil, within a barrel of oil, when you go to refinery, different part of that barrel, a certain amount of it goes into different part of economic sort of productivity, whether it's plastics, which there are clear issues there to be addressed, but other different elements that we rely on, or products that we rely on as byproduct of oil. And if you're not going to get the same value relative to just beyond transportation and other things, you begin to question the profitability over a period of time from just one barrel of oil. So obviously with the transition, we know without even transport as a mainstay and electricity as a sort of a mainstay of, say, oil and gas, there's going to be significant changes as more technology grows in addressing some of those byproduct category areas. So the system thinking is not just limited to national government, but businesses have to do the same thing. And they would have to involve different sort of indicators when you're looking at their models over a certain period of time.
Right, here's one that is perhaps what you're saying, but maybe you have some other elaboration. Is there an established framework or solution available to promote policy coherence in developing countries where existing policies aim to simultaneously address energy demands and align with objectives of the Paris Agreement? So maybe a little bit more developing country challenge, and how is that different?
This is at the heart of the research that I'm currently embarking on. It's a very tough one. And my goal is actually to come up with a framework for that purpose. How do we get a Paris aligned 1.5 national commitment, net zero, whatever it may be, and while we're achieving some of those positive sides of sustainable development. Let me tell you what keeps me up at night. And I know most of you probably will be the same thing given your backgrounds as well. I've been to a number of countries and I looked at some country budgets, and you look at a large share of GDP dependency coming from oil rents to some larger extent. And then you think about the future growth of oil demand, and if that country doesn't have the best infrastructure and technology to address some of the carbon-related issues or methane-related issues, let's say all the big players leave these countries, and I'm not going to mention names, but they leave some of these countries where the technical resolve is not there, the national innovation system is not that big to sort of accommodate a big shot. You just have to realize that how is such a country going to survive? And obviously, there are solutions that have come out there to say there has to be some technology transfer, number one, and there has to be some sort of foreign direct investment directed towards rejigging the economies. But then you don't still solve the problem of dependency with some of these low to middle income countries, because what you've actually done in that cycle of reality is that you've created a whole new global order of dependency. If a country cannot develop its own solar energy, technology, and the materials required, and all the ensemblement that goes with it, wind, and other forms of newer energy, bio, whatever it may be, it does create a problem when you don't have that. So a positive coherence, it's almost aspirational. Let me put it that way. But in actually achieving a positive coherence, right now, instead of my own sort of academic research, I don't know where we go from there, because the challenges, you're going to probably see a greater level of inequality to some larger extent. But we may be able to address, so long as we are aware, I think where we can achieve some semblance of positive coherence is so long as we are aware and we know kind of the avenues to address some of those gaps. It becomes very important, because some of the things that keep me up at night is, how are some countries going to finance their health department? Are they still going to inherently rely much more on subsidies that are coming from global aids that are just going to come into the country? Western dependencies or emerging other dependencies coming from places like China and Africa, and even South America and all those places, or even South Asia sort of region. It's just a big question, and I wish I could give you a very positive answer. I'm just not there yet in my own sort of journey of research to sort of provide that answer.
Great, thanks. Here's another one. It's sort of maybe what you're touching on there. With lower developed countries having delayed implementation of renewables, will developed nations have to contribute massive amounts of resources to have them, quote unquote, catch up here to meet low emissions goals? So some people talk about developing nations leapfrogging developed nations, and I think you were kind of addressing that's maybe not so easy, just to lack of capability and an economy overall, industrial capability. So yeah, how do we think about the interplay of developed countries helping developing countries more? Is this still more for your PhD research? Go ahead.
This has been the challenge, and for those who have followed even the Paris Agreement and the 100 billion funds that were supposed to be raised to help developing countries sort of address some of the challenges. Because if you think about the global emission landscape, the vast majority of the emissions are not necessarily coming from a lot of the developing world, right? We know traditional emissions have emerged out of mostly developed economies, with some emerging economies also going at full speed, as we already know. And part of the failure in earlier agreements was everybody needs to contribute their fair share. Now, the notion is that because of the historical trend in emissions that were sort of achieved by a lot of the developed nations, if developing nations across the spectrum were supposed to develop in that same, you're going to require that same level of intensity, which means that you're going to get to that same higher emissions. And we don't want that, because the climate, again, we are faced with a lot of climate risk going into the future. The reality is that regardless of the financial flows, which right now I don't think last time I checked, we've met even the commitment that were made by a lot of the developed nations. Regardless of that, there's going to be a tremendous amount of gap. Now, I want to entreat all of you to read the OECD's sort of framework around what we call the National Innovation System. It's a system thinking that basically a lot of developed nations have been using for decades. Even in the United States, how we set up our national labs. When a country set up a national lab, the goal is to try to advance a certain not just technology, but some idea or concept or innovation. And that's part of the National Innovation System. If you travel across, and I've worked on national innovation systems for some time, if you kind of walk across many developing economies, there's none of those. They have good universities, they have good maybe in some industrial sector, but not necessarily sort of advanced product, mostly primary products. So most of the times they generate the raw materials, and that gets shipped to a more advanced place to sort of process and bring back, which comes at a higher cost. And again, this has been there in the oil and gas sector. Is always been emblematic of some of the resource curse discussions that have happened in the past. You have to sit on the reality that because of that lack of ecosystem, even when you leapfrog, you're going to face a challenge with maintenance, component sourcing, all of those things, right? Now, the car industry, I'm going to use that as a caveat, is a good example. When, let's say, Chevy decided to build a plant in Mexico many years ago in order to make cars because of some other, obviously, business imperative things, they had to create a whole OEM structure around it and make sure that they had access to all the different things that they needed to make sure that they can create this. So industrial agglomeration is an effective way to build that kind of national system. When you look at how cell phones just ravaged through a lot of these economies, right? We eventually ended up having this electronic waste system in these countries because there was no system for recycling. And you're going to face the same issue with any of these technologies. If you have a big oil and gas economy in a developing world, how are you going to incentivize, low carbon growth or low carbon development? You're going to rely on potentially the big multinational companies. And the question for the multinational companies is it worth an investment to make in that? And if they walk away, what happens to your revenue at scale? And we see what happens even with that, as not mentioning some of these technologies, when there's a slight dip in overall sort of global oil and gas consumption, as an example. So just thinking of that scale is very, very important. India is one country that wants to make sure that they provide electricity for a vast majority of its population. Now, economically, yes, I've built a bunch of, and that was the case. They were planned thousands of coal fire plants that were supposed to be built with efficient technology to remove SOx and NOx from the fluid of these power plants. But at the end of the day, does that help us? Because there's a global value chain around coal, the extraction of it, and the emissions that results in that. So you may use a partial equilibrium integrated assessment model to say that, yes, India may be able to reduce the emissions, but when you use a general equilibrium to assess India overall, well, you're going to have a little bit of a problem because that will not be reducing the emissions at scale. So those are some of the problems you're going to encounter at the end of the day when you think of developing economies and how you sort of think about these transitions. I think is a bigger issue. Most people are aware of it. Most experts, I think the UN Statistical Agency, I believe, have been thinking about good indicators to use to address sustainable development goals in relation to the Paris Agreement. And it may take us some time. I mean, 2015 was when the agreement sort of came into sort of existence. We're almost 7 years away from 2030, a big milestone across both the SDG and the Paris Agreement. And we'll kind of see whether those coherence comes to pass or not, whether we see greater inequality, whether we see better health outcomes, more broader gender equality, more well-established sort of sustainable consumption, and urban sort of living. All of this are going to be critical.
Right. On that note, there's kind of a related question I'll elaborate on, but what are the ways that we call it just transition? Our just transition has been raised in the general energy transition. You mentioned some things there, but do you have, examples of or anything about how, companies or nations have said, well, I'm going to invest slightly differently here because I'm going to think about equality issues specifically and how they made a different choice?
Just transition in itself is a very noble idea, and I'm going to speak purely academically here. I think speaking academically offers a room to be a little bit more objective. I think the just transition is almost thinking about what coherence forces us to think about, which is what are some of the ways we have to address the choices that we make. And I want to restate this, that in each of the questions that being provided, it comes down to choices. And whatever choice that we make regards to energy transition, we are going to face some sort of potential issues that we have to address. And you don't have to look far. In West Virginia, I've driven through some towns. I've lived in Montana, Wyoming, and other places around the world where you see the impact of the absence of a mainstay sector that just kind of disappears overnight or over a very quick period of time. And just transition has become really a conversation about job reskilling, job training, job transfer. I think there is a bigger part of just transition, which in itself is in the word just, right? And if you look at the coherence of the Sustainable Development Goals, inherently, one of the things that reflects, I remember very well, because I lived in DC at the time, and the World Bank had a very big sign in front of its building. And it really said that, a lot of the things about the SDGs were about human dignity. And sometimes you have that often being missed in the concept of just transition, obviously, because it's hard to measure and it's hard to get back into any sort of model that you do. The ethics, the aspirations, the cultural sentiments, the historical understanding of these things often kind of almost evaporates. There are places in California that used to be oil boom towns, and these are desert places. And I think I remember one time I was at an event, and somebody said their roots come from one of these places, but your family history is just basically obliterated because it doesn't really show up on the map anymore. Nobody lives there in these places anymore, and those things sort of become very inherent because I think we can establish the fact that our human history is about identity. We often attribute ourselves to who we are, where we are from, and stuff. And there's some emerging research that are kind of coming up to expand on this definition of just transition beyond just this proprietary focus on just wage and job skilling. They are very good, but I think they don't really cover the extent to which the transition is going to impact communities and places over a longer period of time when people cannot trace back. The UN Heritage, group talk about this all the time. And I think when the coherence was happening, there was actually discussion about different heritages and stuff that may be impacted, not currently known. There's also another part of this equation that most people also don't really think about from a just transition point of view. Many national governments really tied in terms of the nationally determined contributions. And because of that, when you have a yearly, let me put a name and shame, as we often call it, because there are no legal consequences from a sort of a climate perspective, or even the voluntary national reviews, the VNRs that are attached to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so you get your expert or the technocrats to kind of focus on how you're meeting your emissions sort of target that you set for yourself. And the ultimate thing is you're going to be named in shame by people if you don't meet those targets. But you're not going to be named in shame if a vast majority of indigenous people basically don't have any more stay within their sort of economic growth. And that's, I think, becomes a bigger part of the issue as well. Again, back to agenda setting. Who sets the agenda? Who controls the agenda? Wins the conversation. And as much as that is a good part of our what I would consider economic and political system, it is why I think some experts believe that, the Industrial Revolution created greater inequality. Let's see what this energy transition also creates, even though we may be aware of it.
Great, thank you. Here's one on kind of, I guess, just kind of the math of the projections of emissions and net emissions needed to meet targets by 2050 or Paris targets and these kind of things. So have you seen an actual mathematical balance to support the goal of 2050 zero net emissions with positive or negative offsets, since this seems to be largely aspirational than realistic? So you mentioned how close 2030 is, but in terms of net zero, 2050 is kind of around the corner as well. And there's lots of discussions of I don't know, technologies we don't have yet. We'll take direct air capture and carbon storage as close to the holy grail. Fusion, perhaps more so than that. But
Yeah.
how do you think about this? And do you think companies or nations are kind of seriously focusing on these kind of extreme net zero goals?
Kurt, you and I talked about this, and I mean, I will pull you in here. I have not seen anything that's from a realistic level that basically shows that we can get to 2050, but I think we can still try, right? And I want your quick feedback here because that's the reality. I don't know. Have you seen anything like that?
Well, yeah, as maybe the questioner is implying, is you can draw the lines on a chart, and people who look at carbon budget types of analyses, and the drop that's required to meet a carbon budget, it gets steeper and steeper, and we're about to have to make it go backwards in time. But yeah, I'm kind of with you there. I think I kind of like your statement. It's probably not very likely, but it's certainly not going to happen if you don't try. And I think we have to understand some of these trade-offs and try. And of course, you're mentioning our discussions offline about what the economic models may or may not be telling us. I fall into the camp that we don't really have the right economic guidance with the model, so it makes things look more possible than perhaps they are, and we need to just need more accuracy there so we can make better decisions.
And let me say this, for people who are not students of models, there's something that you have to recognize. Models are not a set of reality. They are a set that purports to mimic reality, right? Which means that you have to make assumptions. Some assumptions, when I have been involved in model development, you've had experts, and then you can speak to even your own work. You have experts, we argue about what those assumptions are. Sometimes you need people from different expert communities. You need physicists, you need geomorphologists, you need climatologists, you need different economists and agronomists to a larger extent. You need so many different experts to talk through different assumptions. What do we estimate could be the potential impact of A, B, C, D? What variables do we normalize? Do we keep constant? So it's almost like we're in the lab and we are trying to replicate what could be a reality, right? It doesn't get us to reality, but it gives an idea of what a future looks like. That's what I want people to think about model. And what the 2050 targets does for us is that it gives an idea, wow, this is what the world could look like. But the reality is, to get there, it takes a lot of different rational choices. And that's assuming, again, if you're an economist, you would almost certainly agree that irrationality is the bedrock of a lot of things that happen around us. Your political changes, we've seen that here in the US. Some time ago, we pulled out of Paris. We came back into Paris. You have countries' agenda back to developing economies. If you have a country where, yes, you are very rich in resources, but a vast majority of the population is in poverty, you are thinking about how to get jobs tomorrow for people. And so that feedback we don't have more effectively into our models to be able to capture. Even the integrated assessment models that we see today out there that considers different socioeconomic pathways, less so the RCPs that existed back then with the AR6, AR5 and AR6 from the IPCC. And I think that's very, very important for us to sort of capture. But my opinion, and again, I'm going to speak from just a pure academic opinion, is that net zero is an aspiration. And I think we get it. It's like we are running towards a race, and this is where we want to get to. And so long as we can get there, so we have to do whatever we can to get as close to it as possible. It may be that it's much more realistic in 2070. It may be that it's more realistic in 2060. The technologies that we are talking about, a vast majority of technologies have emerged. Some of them, scalability has become an issue because of technical, economic reasons. Or when you're thinking about CCUS, you're thinking about both capture, storage, and different parts of it. And the consequence that may result from a social acceptance point of view. It is a big issue that you have to think about when you're talking to companies or you're dealing with national government. Now, I haven't surveyed national government to see. I think there was a survey that was done by the UNDP, the UN development program. Back in 2016, one of the last surveys I kind of remember, and I may misquote the year, but they had done an assessment of almost 100 or so countries. And unfortunately, at the time, a vast majority of countries were like, yeah, emissions are really important, but I have an economy that has a high unemployment rate, and I have to think about it.
Right. So this, how about we're getting close to time? We'll end on this last question, which is not necessarily a short answer one. It dances around some of the things you've already discussed, and I'll add something at the end. So the question, how do you envision coherence among standard energy production, fossil fuels and biomass and renewables going forward? So is this a sort of top-down governance issue, perhaps top-down nationally or company-wise? I guess you could discuss what you like. And then, or are there other ways of fostering coherence within the energy system, if you will, to achieve decarbonization? So I think what's seems to have become obvious, if I compare Europeans and at least to the United States, is that Europeans can tolerate at least carrots and sticks. They're at least have a carbon market and they're doing things, and they maybe have some incentives. And with the Infrastructure Act and the laws passed under the Biden administration, it's kind of pure carrots. Go build some stuff. So from a top down, I think about it as the United States saying, hey, if you're a company and you like to build things, and here's some money to go build some things, whether you previously liked to build them or not. And so this, maybe that's some level of coherence, but how do we think about the top down versus some other kind of way?
So I recently found a study that I was doing some research on CCUS, and I found a study done by a number of researchers, and they said that there was no correlation between government sort of funded R&D CCUS and the successful deployment of CCUS at a large commercial scale. In fact, what was much more successful was the business or the market-driven approach. I mean, obviously, that data is a little biased because a lot of the CCUS sort of implementations tilt towards EOR, which is oil and gas, without which we will not be able to actually see much more clearer success when you think of CCUS. But let me put it this way. I think you're going to require both. And you're going to require both a top-down and sort of a bottom-up approach. The caution here is that you have limited resources. And each of these require an expensive degree of testing and sort of resource mobilization. And that is going to, come to head at some point to see what is working and what is not. Some countries obviously have the resources to be able to push this from a top-down perspective, like you just mentioned, even with the European Union. And in American context, our culture is different. We always want companies to try and fail, and then we kind of learn from it and we go. And then before the federal government kind of gets in, things start at the bottom a little bit, right? Before kind of they morph into a bigger sort of acceptance overall. So I think you require both. And the good news is because a lot of the issues around energy transitions is faced by almost all countries, you are going to have lessons learned coming through that you can then use if policymakers and interest groups, I'm not just talking about policymakers only, but interest groups, which is people who are passionate about different parts of the equation, if they can all kind of learn and push for different things, it gets there. The one thing I want to say in conclusion is when it comes to coherence, there is both forced and unforced coherence. And I was thinking about this the other day, back into the early sort of 2000s, but also late 90s into the 2000s when the word global warming was used more often compared to just the concept of climate change. And there were naysayers about global warming and all of that. The classic example of unforced coherence is actually the way we came to finally settle on how to describe climate change and the impact that it's having on us. It came from places of opposing views. And sometimes that's what coherence is. You need the direct opposing views. You cannot negate that because, again, as an economist, I believe in the rationale of information asymmetry. None of us have perfect information. We are all operating on what we believe is the best information, but not the perfect information. And so listening to different parts of the equation forces us to get to the point where we're able to get the more value in the way we think about society and whatnot. It's not saying that we should take what every person is saying and apply it, but what it's saying is that you need those opposing views and opposing realities to making a model better. And that's why, to me, the feedback is so essential in how we kind of address the future. I hope that helps, Kerry, in sort of over. I know there's a lot to talk about, but and I know that most people probably didn't get the answers they were looking for. But that's kind of how complicated and convoluted the whole system is.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your thoughts, and you triggered some nice and engaging questions there from our audience. So thank you to the audience as well. So I'll thank officially again. So thank you again, Michael Benedict Umoa. He's the Director of Engagement at EOS, of part of Federated Hermes. Thank you for joining us today for the UT Energy Symposium.